Hello, welcome on behalf of Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. I would like to welcome you to our webinar, Expectations on the EU-Africa Year. This is the first webinar, our kickoff, in a series of webinars on the relationship between Africa and the European Union. My name is Daniela Ehler. I'm Policy Officer in the Brussels office of Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. I'm here in Brussels, and together with my colleague Anne Felmet from the FES Africa Department, I'm the moderator of today's discussion. Bienvenue à notre webinaire Expectations on the EU-Africa Year. Il est le premier webinaire de notre série de webinaires sur les relations entre l'Afrique et l'Union européenne. Moi, je m'appelle Daniela Ehler, je travaille pour la Fondation Friedrich-Ebert à Bruxelles et je suis ici cet après-midi avec ma collègue Anne Felmet de la Fondation Ebert à Berlin et nous animons, nous deux, la discussion cet après-midi. Je vais me limiter à vous donner quelques instructions techniques et je vais commencer avec la plus importante. Nous offrons interprétation simultanée anglais-français et vous trouvez le bouton pour choisir votre langue préférée dans la barre de contrôle en bas. Well, I will limit myself to give you some quick technical instructions. Let me start with the most important one. We offer interpretation English and French, and to choose your language, you just click in the button in the control bar below, and there you can choose between English and French. I will now continue in English to speed up a little bit. Of course, we would like to make sure that you are also part of the discussion and to include you as much as possible. To participate in our discussion, please use the chat. There you can raise questions and give your comments, which will be then clustered and by Anna and myself and included during the discussion. It is possible to raise your questions in either English, French, or German. These are the languages we can offer. However, please note that the chat is not translated. We will also try to include some questions live via video. For this, please use also the raise your hand button, which you also find in the control bar below. Just a quick reminder, please register with your real name and if possible also with the organization you are representing, which helps Anna and myself to assign and cluster your questions and comments. However, due to the high number of participants, we received about 250 registrations. We will probably not be able to include all your questions and comments. Already apologize for this, but maybe this is just our first webinar. We will be able to bring them up in the upcoming webinars. The discussion will be recorded and later be available on our website, and we will also circulate the link via email. If you would like to tweet, you're most welcome to do that. We also have a hashtag, which you'll find above. Please use the hashtag What's the Offer. And just to conclude, let me give you a quick overview who is with us this afternoon. I just mentioned we have received about 250 registrations. Of course, we have representatives from the European Union, from the Commission, the European Parliament, the External Action Service, but there's also representatives from embassies, permanent representations, and of course experts from NGOs and think tanks. But not only from Brussels, but we also have participants from France, Sweden, Slovenia, Italy, Germany, the UK, just to mention a few of them. And I would like to give a very warm welcome to our African partners who are watching us from, among others, Senegal, Namibia, Rwanda, South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania. So thank you. So thank you very much for your interest in our discussion. Just to conclude, a big thank you already to our two interpreters, and a special thank you to my colleague Philip, who is our technical support in the background, to make this webinar, that the webinar runs as smoothly as possible, I hope. Nevertheless, I apologize already for all technical issues. We are all in home office, and which sometimes puts internet connections under fire. Nevertheless, I wish you an interesting debate, and I hand over to my colleague Anna.
Yeah, thank you, Daniela, and also warm welcome from my side. I'm very much looking forward to this exchange with so many experts from both Africa and Europe. As you probably know, the renewal of the relations between the European Union and Africa and the African Union was supposed to be high on the agenda this year. Things have, of course, changed a bit, but the revision and the development of quite a number of strategies, instruments, and also events are still in progress. Of course, to name just a few, the EU-Africa strategy presented in March and was supposed to be further developed throughout the year. We have the AU-EU summit under the German Council presidency planned for November this year. We have the finalization of the Cotonou Agreement. And we have the development and programming of quite a number of new finance instruments. In DICI, the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, just to name a couple of these. And as currently everywhere, Corona is of course changing things, will have impacts on the partnership between the two continents. I think that is clear. It brings along a number of challenges and obstacles, but it may also have an opportunity to start the new partnership right here. That's what we want to discuss today. The FES is monitoring these year's processes and developments through a number of activities. We initiated a participation process through which we collected voices and opinions from our partner organizations throughout Africa. Some of those are present in this webinar, as Daniela just said. Some of the results and findings of this participation process will be included in our webinar today and also the upcoming ones. And we will publish the findings in a publication at the end of our webinar series. Our webinar series is running under the title, What's the Offer? You've probably noticed that. Here we want to discuss the offers lying at the table, from both sides, so the African one and the European one. And today we want to have a closer look at the ongoing renewing of the partnership, its priorities, and of course also the challenges and opportunities the pandemic might pose to this partnership. And last but not least, I would like to already thank our speakers, which you will see in a moment. We'll of course introduce them to you in a moment as well. And big thank you to you, all the participants, for taking your time for this very important discussion today.
Okay. Anna, thank you very much. That brings us to our first speaker, to our opening speech. I don't see him yet, but I think he will join us in a moment. He is. Welcome, Udo Bullmann. Hello. Yes, Udo will do, we are very happy that you do the opening today, also to set a little bit the scene for today's discussion. Let me quickly introduce you. You're a member of the European Parliament since 1999. You're a member of the S&D group and currently the coordinator of the S&D group for the Development Committee. Udo, when the new EU strategy with Africa was published in March, you emphasized the alignment of the strategy with the SDGs and the Agenda 2030. And you also underlined to have a fair and in particular equal partnership with Africa, the EU needs to move beyond the donor-recipient relationship. So I guess in your view, the strategy is not yet mission accomplished. So, but just like, let's say, a first step. So maybe what is your take on the recently published EU-Africa strategy, and what are, in your view, the next necessary steps when it comes to the implementation? Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much.
The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Anna and Daniela. Thanks, Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. I'm very pleased to hear that we have participants from all sides of Europe, but also from Africa. That is marvelous. Welcome to everybody. Happy to join you and to be with you. Let me perhaps first of all say, since we are talking about Corona, the Corona crisis, of course, you know that when the Commission published the new Africa strategy early March, we couldn't imagine what is going on a couple of weeks later. So, of course, we have to take into account the given situation and also what we may already think is a change of preconditions, a change of conditions to implement and to design, redesign. We will see what is the Africa strategy. So give me the chance for a couple of remarks before I start into the substance. Even if the European Union today is in the eye of the storm, we should not go for a mistake. We should not end up as European policymakers in an inward-looking approach. That would be a huge failure for Europeans to only focus on our situation and not to reflect what it is for the Global South, what impact it will have for Africa. As Commissioner Oppelan rightly said, if you do not defeat the virus everywhere, there is no chance to have victory anywhere. That is an issue that we have to have permanently in our focus, and that is also something we have to come back to when we talk about resources, because today everybody in Europe is occupied by European mobilization of resources for our member states, but that will by far not be enough, as we already have seen. The disaster in the Global South, the disaster especially in the African countries, is still to come, unfortunately. And we have to be afraid that accumulation of threats is going to occur. Once you see that Corona is going to come to the African nations, you already know that that will further polarize between rich and poor, that will further polarize between those who can help themselves and those who are exposed to the disaster. And you can also see that we are going to get an hunger crisis, a huge hunger crisis. Current data speak about 270 million to 300 million in real nutrition crisis. We have to be aware of that. And that shows us the dimension of the challenge when we today speak about Africa and the forthcoming months and years. Very, very forward-looking, we know that by the end of the century, that is one generation, the lifespan of one generation, nearly half of our global population is made up from African people. Please let us be aware of that, because that also shows us that we should not, we must not treat Africa as a peripheral continent anymore. Africans tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, will decide what way the globe is going to take. And talking about partnership is a nice thing, but we have to be serious about the capacity of African nations to shape our common future. So we are in one situation, we are on one globe, and that gives me the idea of my following remarks. When we assess together with our friends from the NGOs the Africa strategy of the Commission, and we welcomed especially the personal commitment of Commissioner Opelainen. She has committed herself to Africa enormously. I know that from her personally, and she demonstrates that in all her speeches and travelings. We had to acknowledge that we have improvements here. Yes, the paper is clear about the fact that benefits have to be mutual, that we are going to take a multilateral and not a unilateral approach anymore, that we have to improve our coordination as European member states when it comes to development policies, and that climate change, of course, has to play an important role in our further collaboration. That is on the good, that is on the positive side, but we could also identify deficiencies, things we have to talk about, things to have to reflect about. Our reading was that to a good portion, the spirit is the spirit of economic investment. Very often economic investment in the best interest of Europeans. We know that European policymakers in the past were very afraid of the relationship with China and the Chinese influence in Africa. So some parts appeared to us as countering China as an investor in Africa, but this gives not a holistic picture already. We need a holistic concept, a holistic concept that takes also note of the dynamics of poverty and inequality within Africa, that focuses on the empowerment, especially also of vulnerable groups, women and youth, that we need to reflect on the interrelationships in Africa, mobility as well as economic exchange, and that we have to give a special attendance to the fight against corruption and criminal financial outflows out of the continent. So this was the balance before Corona hit on the globe. And what is now our conclusion from there? What can we perhaps predict? In which way should we discuss further ongoings, further plans? Do we have to revise our instruments? Question mark. Do we have to revise the African strategy? For us in the Social Democrat group, for us in the Development Committee, one thing is clear. We already started our mandate by saying, please let us take the fight against inequality in the Global South as a strategic element for improving the chances of the Sustainable Development Goals also in the Global South. The fight against inequality is a strategic trigger point to also fight poverty, to also help gender equality, to also improve our investment in the environment and in sustainable economic relationships. I would like to say that Corona gives me the idea that this is afterwards even more important than before, to fight inequalities, to help also to empower African societies, empower the young generation, empower women to take responsibility in social life, in the economy, in the political life will be crucial. And only if we fight inequality by measuring our European output, our impact on African societies, by ex ante as well as ex post analysis of what and how development policies is impacting on inequalities in African societies, we can be successful. Otherwise, we will fail. We will perhaps put a lot of energy into the wrong games, and that is what we should not do. Healthcare and quality education for all has to be one of our cornerstones of the recovery program. It's not only about reboosting economic life, it's about rebuilding the societies towards a better sustainability to the benefit of all its members. And public services, healthcare and quality education are crucial for that. I've already mentioned the role of women and young people, but we also have to say yes, we have to invest in governance capacities. Only if governance capacity enables actors to be active and to support them with the right political programs, with the right economic programs, reaching out also to the villages in the peripheral and poorer areas, we have a chance to win the match. And it means that we also have to talk about financial resources. If you see how difficult the struggle within Europe is and the huge volume that we will need to rebuild European economies, you may imagine how difficult it's going to be to mobilize the financial resources for the global South. It's good that there were the promises of 20 billion of the European Union towards the global South and towards Africa, but this is not fresh money. And we need fresh money to organize this big jump forward and to organize a policy that does not leave anybody behind. That touches also on our tax policies within Europe as well in the industrialized world, as well as in the global South. We cannot afford that a huge margin of profits, of gains, of the economic life are afterwards the victim of illegal outflows going to tax havens, to the happy few rich, and are not anymore at the disposal of African nations. That has to be a new challenge for our political collaboration. And here we, the Europeans, have also to deliver. Same applies to the reorganization, this is my last point, to the reorganization of our trade policies. We have a very vivid debate in our Committee for International Trade, rightly so. We have to take a break. We cannot continue business as usual. We have to redefine our trade policy towards more sustainable value chains, but especially also to the capacity building on the African continent, so that we do not only have the outflow of resources, but we more and more move to complete production and value chains within the African continent. That would be to the benefit of all citizens in the African nations. And that is my take for the opening of our conversations. A lot of questions, but also a couple of ideas where we should continue with by fighting Corona and in the years thereafter. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Udo, very much for those first insights on those first ideas for our further discussion. I'm sure we'll get back to them again and again during the webinar. I would now like to introduce to you our two other panelists. Of course, Udo will be on the panel as well, but we have two more panelists. There's Faten Agat. She's the Senior Advisor to the AU High Representative on the EU-AU negotiations. She works as an international consultant and is a business associate of the Mandeleo Group based in South Africa. Hello, Faten, welcome. And we have Christina Hackenes. She's the head of the program for inter and transnational cooperation at the German Development Institute based in Bonn. Among other areas, she works on EU-Africa and Africa-China relations. Welcome to both of you once again. I would like to jump right into the discussion, but maybe one question back to you, Udo, first. Can you give us some insights on the current status of the processes of the strategy, the EU-Africa strategy, and the Cotonou discussions, maybe? What's the current status? Are discussions still going on? Is it pausing right now? Do you have some insights?
No, we have, on Cotonou, we have ongoing discussions between the co-legislators, but it's very difficult, I have to tell you. It's very difficult with Cotonou, it's very difficult with NDG. So my take for the moment is that we need the very best collaboration between the European Parliament and the Commission to take also not to lose track, but also to take a fresh step forward, adjusting what we had foreseen according to the challenge that become bigger and bigger.
Thank you. And then maybe getting to you, Fatin, what are offers and expectations from the African side? We have heard some ideas now from the European side. It's gone through the press also. But what are topics discussed at the level of the African Union concerning the renewal of the relationship between the two continents?
Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation and for having involved us in this conversation. And yeah, good afternoon to all of the participants who have joined us. In terms of expectations, but also, I mean, one of the questions that you're asking is, you know, what is on offer? And I would actually like to start with that particular point. Maybe take us a step back for a little bit to the Lisbon summit in 2007, where cognizant of a changing global environment that both European and African leaders at the time have, and I would quote, resolved to build a new strategic political partnership for the future, overcoming the traditional donor-recipient relationship. And we fear that 13 years later on, we're still actually far from meeting that particular ambition. And things have in fact moved further since 2007 that leave us with no other option but to move increasingly towards that vision that the leaders had agreed on in 2007. From the African side, I mean, there are quite a number of considerations that are making this agenda even more important for us. The first one, I think it's no secret that the partnership has largely been based on aid. It's largely an aid-based relationship, and very often when the partnership is talked about, the numbers related to aid are mentioned. The fact, for instance, that the EU is the largest aid provider to Africa. Even though, when if we take a step back from this snapshot narrative, as I would call it, and look at the trends. In fact, since 1990, I would say, the place of the EU as a major provider of aid has been eroding. If I can just put some numbers there, between 1990 and 1999, the EU's share, and I'm talking Commission and Member States combined, of aid to Africa constituted 67%. And between 2010 to 2017, that dropped to 58%. Well, of course, the EU remains the largest funder, the largest donor in terms of development aid, but we see that declining, and we do expect that will decline in the next 20, 30 years even further. What we've also been observing is the fact that, and I think Udo rightly so referred to that the trade arrangements that we had concluded are simply not delivering. If I take they're not delivering, and there's not enough political commitment to them. Well, only 15 African countries have joined or signed the EPAs. Most of them remain in transition form. But interestingly enough, the fact that they've concluded EPAs has not particularly had an impact on their access to the European market. In fact, until last year or so, we've been registering deficit as a continent in terms of trade with Africa. And I think the situation at the moment with COVID-19 raises even more questions. Udo referred to the fact that 15 billion have been made available, including to Africa. Looking at the numbers, we're actually talking of 3.2 billion, not 15 billion, that are given to Africa, excluding guarantees and EIB funds. And even that money is not new. It's reallocated money from the European Development Fund and the neighborhood instrument with respect to North Africa. And it's having, in fact, from the information that we have, quite some impact on the member states that have seen such reallocations take place. And it's raising questions, I mean, particularly in the context of slow progress in terms of the EU budget negotiations. And the fact that the EDF is outside of the budget, I'm aware that the Parliament has asked the Commission to look into that. But the fact that there is no follow-up, no conclusion of the budget, etc., raises even more questions on the issue of predictability of aid. So one, it's the allocation. Number two, of what are the next steps. So, and the fact that there's no new money, and to some degree, one can argue, understandably so, if the EU is going through its own internal financing challenges. The world is watching basically how the EU is even negotiating internally in terms of its the packages it's offering to its member states. So we are aware of those challenges, and I think it would be, I would say, almost delusional to expect that Africa as a continent would have any special treatment. So we have to be very realistic, very pragmatic in terms of what the continent wants. And so that takes me then to where do we see our role? How do we see our role with respect to the EU? The ambition to still move away from aid has been emphasized on numerous occasions. Not least through a number of processes that the African continent, within the framework of the African Union, has put in place. And we're very familiar, for instance, with the African peace and security architecture, the entire work being done around peace and security through the African peace and security architecture. But we're going into another terrain, I would say, with the entry into force of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which we see, I would say, as a very critical tool for the continent to be able to create a bit more resilience to some of these shocks, to tap into the internal market, which is not insignificant. But also, I think what that will require is that we look into, and again, Udo raised the issue at the point of regional chains, for instance, within Africa, which now, again, with COVID, has put that issue back at the center. This dependence on China, for instance, in terms of provision of certain products. I think not just for Africa, but I think for many other regions of the world, is raising some questions as to the need also to look in the continent for ways to create a bit more independence, but in fact interdependence within the continent to be able to address those issues. So we've been putting into place quite a number of processes, I would say, be it in the area of peace and security and governance, not to forget that one, in the area of trade and investment, where we say it's time really for us to work on some of these issues. And I think we've come actually a long way in the last 20 years in providing that framework, which I would say is also an opportunity. I mean, speaking of offer, I think it's far more interesting for partners to engage with a continent that provides a market that's attractive for the investor, for a continent that can contribute beyond being a recipient to peace and security and stability on the continent, to mediation of political tensions in certain contexts, etc. So that would in fact be quite a solid offer to all international partners, the EU included. Now, if I look at the expectations now, specifically in terms of EU-Africa relations, the key point that we keep on insisting on is that it's very important to move again beyond traditional ways of cooperating. The heads of states in, I believe, November 2018 made it very clear that the continent-to-continent partnership remains important for Africa. But we need obviously to conclude a type of agreement that is attractive enough also for Africa. There are certain issues that obviously remain in the realm of sovereignty, if I can put it that way, where countries do have the flexibility to engage bilaterally. And there are some issues that are the realm of continental policy. In the same way, one interesting analogy that a colleague often likes to refer to, in the same way that, for instance, some EU countries are members of NATO and members of the EU, being part of one does not exclude engagement with the other. And so with respect to Africa, what we have said is that there are certain areas where countries do have obviously freedom and they're sovereign and engaging in, but there are certain areas that we need to keep as continental priorities, and we need to engage on continentally. And the heads of states agreed that those areas would be trade because of the entry into force of the Continental Free Trade Area. It would be peace and security and governance for obvious reasons, the existence of the peace and security architecture. It would be migration because we simply cannot detach North Africa, an important transit region, from sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel region when we speak of migration and our relations with Europe in that respect. And the other area is climate change, because again, we do have continental structures to handle that, and it's a transnational issue. It's open, obviously, that to add other areas depending on the discussions that we're currently having, but those are really the 4 priority areas. And so we do expect the EU to engage with the continent on those areas, respecting the principle of subsidiarity, respecting the spirit of partnership in terms of joint agenda setting, where we feel that slipped a bit away over the last few years, because we did not have structures really to do that joint priority setting. So we see perhaps a return slowly to unilateral prioritization. But maybe just to conclude, I think I see 4 challenges, if I can put them in that category, in the relationship moving forward, and the expectation is really to engage with the partners in the EU on how do we move beyond that. I'd say the first is that we need to imagine our partnership as Europe, Africa, beyond relations, our respective relations with other partners. I think that's very important. I think the partnership does have things to offer, but we need, and I think Udo also alluded to that point, to look at our partnership in its own right. And I think there can be quite a bit to offer there. The second one is that we need to go beyond lists. It's very nice, and I think we would all agree that Europe and Africa should cooperate on peace and security. I mean, the list is there even before any document comes out. I think the challenge is to give sense to these lists by being very clear on how we will implement those strategies. And when I talk of implementation, I'm talking about the dialogue, the governance structures that we will put around that, also the financing structures that we will put around that. And on this particular aspect, I think we're very aware, at least on the African side, that there is co-responsibility there. That's why, for instance, the African Peace Fund was put into place to try and address some of these issues. But we need to move beyond wish lists, if I can put it that way. I think the third one is that, and that may be a bit of a sensitive one, is that we need to think in terms of outcomes and beyond institutional interests. I think we need to be imaginative, and we need to try and deliver based on the outcome. If we need to adjust the interests around that, we may need to do it. Otherwise, we're stuck in, recycling the same issues. And the last point that I would like to insist on is that we need to recognize that there is African agency here. That there is an increasing sense of ownership over how do we engage with our international partners. That may put some partners, make them a bit uncomfortable, but that is the reality. And I think the sooner we acknowledge that African agency, the more we can move actually forward in truly forging a partnership of equals that is a win-win situation for all partners. Thank you.
Thank you for this contextualization and a lot of points which we'll definitely discuss during the next couple of minutes. But maybe before that, coming to you, Christine, and maybe taking on a more global picture, because the European Union is, of course, not the only stakeholder or player in the room that has an offer to the African continent. And Udo has also mentioned, or both of you, Fatin has also mentioned China as well, for example, being only one of the other actors. How would you put that into context, the offer that's on the table from the European Union and the offers from other stakeholders?
Yeah, hello everybody, and thank you also from my side for having me at this conversation about the future of EU-Africa partnership at a very timely moment. Yeah, you asked me to put the partnership a bit in a broader perspective, and so I would maybe like to start a bit with a bigger picture. When we look at how the context for EU-Africa relations has changed in the past 3-4 years, I would say what is very clear is that there is more competition and there is a stronger interest from different external actors in cooperating with African partners, which is very good, first of all. We have been speaking about China's presence in Africa at least since 2006, and then also about the BRICS countries. But what has been new in the past 3-4 years is that there are more external actors who are interested in engaging with African countries and the AU. So there is Russia now also being interested, more strongly cooperating with Africa. There's Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and other actors. And China, of course, is also still very present. And so there is more economic competition. But what we also see that there is a stronger competition really of political models, and in particular with China. And the corona pandemic now is not putting all of this on hold, so to say, but might be even further accelerating geopolitical competition of different external actors incorporating with African partners. And for the EU, this now means that, well, there is a bigger question of what really makes the EU an attractive partner for the AU and for African countries. Where's the EU's value added in comparison to other external partners, China and others? And I think in the past couple of days and weeks, a lot has focused on the very immediate response to the corona pandemic, and mainly to the health response, or a response to the health crisis, and then a little bit already to the social and economic crisis that is also part of the corona implications. But and there maybe the EU has been slower than than China and other external actors, also because it has been a lot busy with dealing with the corona pandemic within the EU, first of all. But I think when we now move beyond the immediate and short-term response, the next couple of weeks and months will be very important in order to put the partnership on a sustainable footing in the medium to longer term. And I think it's important to already in the next couple of weeks and months think a little bit more of what the corona pandemic means for the EU-Africa partnership with regard to social implications, economic implications, There is the debt issue, which is very important and which has already been discussed more in the past couple of weeks. But there's also a question of the political implications. And when you now look at the comprehensive strategy with Africa, that the communication that the European Commission has tabled early March, I think there is a lot, and where now the Council is going to prepare Council conclusions, and this is going to be discussed with African partners. There's a lot that can be built upon, but maybe there are a few issues where a different emphasis needs to be placed in light of the competition with other external actors that is there, but also in light of the implications of the corona pandemic. And I would like to put emphasis on 3 points, Faten Agat and Udo Bohlmann also have raised a number of other points that I would very much subscribe to, and that we could also discuss further later on. So 3 points that I think are really important is, and where the EU maybe has also a value added compared to other partners, is first of all that what the EU has proposed in the past and what it should put more emphasis on is a value-based partnership. We have seen in the dealing with the corona pandemic that state institutions and trust in state institutions is really key. We have seen that in Europe, but also in African countries and in other places. And support or cooperation on governance reforms, on inclusive institutions has already been a topic that is part of the EU-Africa partnership, and that has a place in the communication. But I think it would a lot more emphasis would need to be put there. The second point or aspect where I think more emphasis or a different twist would be needed when moving forward is a discussion around sustainability. I mean, how to build economies and societies after Corona, so to say, building back better is the key word for me. And here, before Corona, the EU had a big discussion about so-called European Green Deal, and climate has already been an agenda of the EU-Africa partnership in the past. But what we see now is that this discussion, maybe there is a question of how important this discussion is going to be within the European Union in a post-Corona context. And depending how important, whether the EU is still serious in implementing the European Green Deal, if this is the case, I think this could be a really important issue also for the EU-Africa partnership, because the Green Deal is not just about climate, but it's also an economic program. And I think there are a lot of interesting entry points when thinking about support for investments, for private sector engagement, job creation, etc. On the continent. So I think this is a key aspect or a key agenda that would need to be taken forward. And then the last point for me would be EU-Africa cooperation with regard to the multilateral system, because the effective multilateralism has been a key objective for the European Union in the past, and also the AU and African countries have a strong interest in building effective multilateral institutions. And Corona has once more shown that first the importance of strong multilateral institutions, but also the crisis of the multilateral system. And we see that divergences between the United States and China in multilateral organizations can block decision-making and block organizations. We have seen that in the UN Security Council, but also in the G20 and other places. And I think when reflecting about the future of the multilateral system, the EU-Africa partnership is really important, and maybe there could be a new impetus for a European-African alliance on the future of and reform of multilateral institutions, because there is a strong interest on both continents in having strong multilateral institutions. And if European and African actors are not going to take this agenda forward, I think there is a question of where is impetus and reform coming from, so to say. So this would be for me 3 key points in brief. And as I said, I think I would have a few comments and remarks on Udo Bullmann's and Faten Agat's inputs as well. But maybe I would come to that later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina Akenes, also for outlining a little bit this multilateral dimension, and also emphasizing the other actors who are active in Africa. I just would like to remind you that you can use the chat to raise your questions and comments, and also to use the raise your hand button, sorry, so that we can bring you in via video. I have a few questions here in the chat. The first one would be, maybe I give you 3 questions. The first question is about, in view of the corona crisis, is about debt relief. If it would be necessary now, in view of the corona crisis, that the European Union negotiates a cancellation of some of the African countries who are highly indebted. A second question refers to the assessment of the future. It was also already mentioned by Udo and by Faten, to the future of the economic partnership agreements. And our participant would be also interested to have an assessment of G20 compact for Africa. Is that still alive, or more or less dead? And then maybe a last question, who comes from, I don't see it, but I liked it very much, from Tanzania. I don't see it here. I'm a little bit lost in the chat. Yeah, the question was about the future of the world. Udo mentioned the future of the world is in Africa, and our participant would like you to elaborate a little bit more on that. So that are the 3 questions from the chat. I don't know, maybe we start with the question of debt relief. I don't know who would like to take this question. Faten, Udo? Okay, good. Then start with Faten and then Udo, please.
The other way around is also fine. Please go ahead, Udo.
No, Faten, go.
Good.
Okay, thank you. Well, briefly, I think the issue of debt relief is extremely important on the African continent. Recently, the UN Economic Commission for Africa estimated that Africa will need around 100 to 150 billion to recover from the impact of COVID-19. Actually, not to even recover, but just to deal with the current needs. And so, as some of you are aware, there's quite an intensive process. In fact, just today, the African Union Commission facilitated further discussions with private lenders in particular, because we've had some positive responses from the IMF, etc. Although China still needs to come on board, but the private lenders where actually quite a lot of debt sits. Their role is very critical, and there's slow progress on that at the moment. But as you know, there is a panel that has been put, or a team of special advisors that has been put into place to negotiate and try to find a resolution to that, and that's being done collectively. to try and find a resolution, both with multilaterals and private lenders. But I think what's clear is, I mean, to answer the question, yes, I think it would be extremely positive if there is debt relief to provide some fiscal space for countries to deal with that. On the issue of EPAs, very briefly, and the G20 compact, I mean, what I would say is that what's clear with, considering that 54 countries have signed and that 32 have so far ratified the African Continental Free Trade Area, is that the CFTA is the key policy engagement tool for us with respect to trade and investments. And so whatever is there will at some stage have to follow. I mean, obviously, some African countries do have engagements within the framework of the economic partnership agreements. There is no intention to break any of those legal engagements. I think all countries have indicated they will do so. They will respect those engagements, but I mean, in the medium term is not particular a huge concern. There are denunciation clauses that would allow countries to withdraw should from the EPAs when time comes. So such is not a huge concern in the medium term. But what we will need to ensure at the moment is that the CFTA parts that are still to be concluded are done, and then obviously increase the ratification pace. But that is the core policy framework, and I think many partners, although not all, have understood that the CFTA that they need to engage with it in its own right, with no other tools such as the EPAs as its basis. Because that simply will not work. Yeah, I mean, the fact that there is that political commitment, if we look at least the numbers, should give a clear indication that the CFTA is the main engagement tool there.
Would you like to add?
Yes, on debt relief, for me, it's an issue number one. Because forget for 1 second about COVID-19. Only if you underline what Christina rightly pointed to, that we need a transformational exercise to work towards the fulfillment of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And this is for us in the European Parliament extremely important, for my group extremely important. We invested ourselves to find solutions for the domestic discourse of the European Union during the last years. During this mandate, we are going to concentrate on the external dimension, because Europe must have an interest that the rest of the world, especially the global south, is able to contribute, willing and able to contribute to sustainability goal of the United Nations. But a simple exercise, who can afford this transformation? Because this transformation needs investments. Of course, you will have a lot of payoffs, and at the very end, it's a wonderful exercise, and it will pay off, and your societies will gain. But you need to invest to do this transformational exercise. Who has the resources to invest? And here we have to struggle on all our levels for an effective debt relief, so that our friends, our partners have the room for maneuvering towards this goal. Otherwise, it cannot be successful. So I can only applaud to the question. I see the absolute necessity to that.
Thank you very much. One comment, Fatin, the interpreters say they have problems hearing you. Maybe you can come a bit closer to the computer. Yeah, that would be great. I would take in 3 questions from our video, the option to pose questions by video. We have a couple of raised hands. I would pick 3, and yeah, we cluster those questions and then give them to our panelists. There's a question from Stephen Adawan, then I would pick Manfred Oehm and then Joel Odigi. So if we could get Stephen with picture or video and sound, that would be great. Yes, hello, Stephen. Floor is yours. Please try to make it short since we're a bit running out of time. Thank you.
Yeah. Good afternoon to you all, and thanks for inviting me to join the conversation, and also thank you to our panelists. My issue, obviously, is, it is a fact that COVID-19 will have adverse implications for several African countries. And one of the areas I already foresee it has to do with the likely impact on elections or the democratic dispensation in most African countries. Most 2020 elections, most African countries will have elections this year. And in the case, for example, I'm from Ghana, and in the case of Ghana, for example, there are already discussions and tensions in regards to kind of like having a new voters register, and the likelihood that because of the COVID-19, the elections might not come on. And it will be, the conviction is that, or the anticipation is that some other authoritarian, or should I say repressive states, will use the opportunity to stay on, and others to have also affect other countries that have some kind of like democratic resilience. Now, in terms of the EU-African partnership, Udo and of course Christine and Faten, you made mention about issues related to economic aspects and all of job creation, migration, and all of that. Now, the emphasis is that, for example, for Udo mentioned about the need to tackle inequality. But of course, inequality also comes with equal partnership. If you are talking about economic partnership agreements, how many countries have signed on to the economic partnership agreements? And what are their reservations? And with these partnership agreements, is there any form of equality? Because if you're talking about partnership, then it should be a partnership. And in how far, for example, are African countries able to access European markets? You know, we have to also take into consideration that African countries are also vulnerable. And of course, we have China also lurking around. So to what extent, or in how far do you think COVID-19 will affect issues of sustainability, political stability, and what will be the likely implications in terms of economic partnerships between the EU and African countries?
Thank you. Maybe, do you want to introduce yourself briefly? Sorry, I didn't say that earlier. Just a sentence on who you are, maybe.
Yeah, I'm Stephen Adawan, and I'm originally from Ghana, but currently an assistant professor at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands.
Thank you very much, and well noted your question. We'll give them to the panel after the two other questions. So can we get Manfred Oehm, please, with video and audio for the next question?
So.
Yes, hello.
Yeah, hello to everybody, and thanks for taking me in. I have two remarks which are, well, Manfred Oehm, I'm head of the Africa department of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I have two remarks which are, according to my opinion, are important when we look at the new strategy and the upcoming summit in October. Well, because of the pandemic again, The first remark points more towards what is going on in Europe, because I think we have an opportunity sort of to shape the broader narrative and agenda about the relationship between the two continents. Now, since 2015, and I think Udo had pointed it out as well, you know, in Europe, relations to Africa are very much perceived as something about migration and something about investment. And it has been pointed out now other issues are on the agenda. But also when we look at the investment agenda, I mean, those initiatives will certainly lose traction, partly because the sort of money that has been expected will not be available so easily. So there's a question mark behind the investment agenda for the time being, which I perceive as an opportunity, you know, to, well, shape the narrative or the particular European perception on the relations. I mean, let's work on a more progressive narrative. I'll cut short here. The second point is, as we obviously are interested in, you know, fields for cooperation, I'm also looking for opportunities and looking at what is happening with the pandemic. It appears that a lot of companies and governments, you know, found out there's a certain risk in depending in global production chains, depending on one region, Asia, that is. So the question is, you know, in what economists call reshoring, multi-shoring, and so whether African countries will get a share of production that might be relocated from one region to another, maybe to Africa. And, you know, if there is a possibility, I mean, it would be great if instruments from the European side, if the agenda of the upcoming summit could look at how to support that, because actually it's in the benefit of both continents or countries from both continents. It's just one example where there might be opportunities for a sort of cooperative engagement, which is so needed in the benefit of both. And Fatin had pointed to that as well. I'll stop here. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Manfred. And then we'll take a third question before going back to the panel. Joel Odigi. Can we please get him in? If he's there. That doesn't seem to be the case. Okay, we'll check whether he'll come in for a later question. And for the moment, I'll give it back to the panel, maybe to you, Christina, first. Well, yeah, pick the question you want to answer. I think there were like quite a couple that, well, Joel is there now. Then we'll take his questions before going back to the panel.
Hello.
Hello, Joel. Please try to make it short, as short as possible. Oh,
a very direct question.
Great, go ahead. So introduce yourself first, please.
Okay. The name is Akato Joel Odije. I'm the Deputy General Secretary of the African Regional Organization of the International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC Africa. So we represent 18 million working men and women in 52 of the 54 African countries. So my question is a direct one. It's not a question that is COVID-19 new, so to speak, but it's a question that COVID-19 re-emphasizes very strongly: the absence of social contracts. Our understanding of Europe and its development as citizen quite for a number of countries was that the welfare state was critical to the development of Europe. With this summit, thinking for Africa, before now, even before COVID-19, there was a good understanding that social protection is a way to drive development, defeats poverty and inequality on the continent. But African government, we always say the economy is stupid. Where are the monies? And one of the ways we have realized is that with taxation, you can drive the financing of development in this instance. But our experience has been that big businesses on our continent don't pay taxes where they make profits. And we've been having this discussion back and forth with OECD and all of that with respect to how you stop illicit financial flow from Africa. So my question is, how will this summit help, really put at the center the question of how Africa can also finance its own development through taxation, through making sure that European businesses pay fair taxes in Africa. And the second one is that there is a whole lot of public asset loot from Africa to Europe. African politicians stealing African monies and taking it to European banks. How do we also help improve this kind of leakages in terms of so that we can drive the desired mutual cooperation that we want to see? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel, for this question. Now going back to the panel, and I would give the word to you first, Christina.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I come in with 2 or 3 brief points. First, Stephen, maybe on the first part of your question, which was more about the political implications of the corona pandemic. I fully agree with your assessment that, I mean, first there is practical questions on how elections can be held under these circumstances, and these are questions that all countries are facing. But then there is a serious risk that, especially in weak democratic structures or in already authoritarian contexts, that governments use the pandemic in order to further restrict political rights and civil liberties. So I think there is a serious risk. And this was actually also one of the reasons why I feel that, I mean, there is EU-Africa cooperation has been based on a value-based partnership in the past. And I think, I mean, given that there are these risks, it's even more important that these topics remain relevant in the partnership, even though this is, of course, a difficult agenda to cooperate and work on. And maybe 2 comments to respond to Manfred, to your points. Is there room for a new or a different narrative on cooperating with African countries? And maybe a more, you said, progressive narrative. Yes, I would say yes, there is maybe scope for that, but I think there's also scope for a different narrative for the overall partnership, so to say. Faten, you mentioned and emphasized the point that there's really a need to move away from a donor-recipient partnership and find a different type of engagement between both continents. And I think the corona pandemic brings some opportunities, because it's clear that this crisis is facing all countries, and I mean, it hit the European Union very seriously and European countries very seriously. So it's there is no longer, we don't have a situation where European countries know what to do, so to say, and come to African partners and say, yeah, this is how it should be done. There's learning on all sides that is very heavily required, and I think. I mean, this is also an opportunity to maybe find a different rhetorics, but more importantly, a different approach to the partnership, because it's clear that, I mean, it's getting less asymmetric, so to say. And Manfred, you also asked or mentioned opportunities for EU-Africa cooperation, and in particular whether there is room for shifting value chains and relocation of production towards African countries. There was is a discussion, or has been a discussion on that already pre-corona, so to say. And in particular questions around whether there's opportunities from production in China to move towards African countries. I'm not sure whether, I would be skeptical whether there is a big opportunity now because of the rebuilding after Corona, so to say. But again, I think that discussions around sustainability transformation in Europe and a different type of engagement with countries around the world could bring more opportunities for jobs and economic engagement. So I think opportunities more come from that debate rather than from a per se relocation that is now needed because of value chains that need to be looked at differently after Corona.
Thank you, Christina. And then maybe giving the word to you, Odo, since there was a question to you on equal partnerships and how equality can be guaranteed here.
A quote from Faten, let's concentrate on the outcome, because I think this is a very useful approach. I come back to my remark about how to measure what we are doing. The European Union should know what we are doing and what kind of impact we are having with our support, trade, policies, all kinds of on the African continent. I started a debate in the European Parliament at the beginning of the mandate that I would wish to have ex ante measurement of our policies, not only with reference to development aid, but also to agriculture, to fisheries, to trade, so that we have an idea of what our impact is. And that especially, and that is to Stephen, is applicable to our partnership agreements, because we have to know whom do we benefit at the very end. Is it empowerment what we really boost, or is it dependency what we boost with our partnership agreements? That is for me the decisive question, and I'm very open and I'm working for revising what we are doing here. But the same applies also to Joël's remark, how can we finance our own development? Coming back to the legislative capacities of the European Parliament, it was a couple of years ago that I think we were the first parliament to successfully pass a bill safeguarding country by country reporting on mineral and forestry industries. That is, for instance, an element of leverage, that you at least see, that you at least know where profits are shifted to and where taxes are paid. We need more measures like that. And I invite ourselves and our member states in the European Union, as well as globally, to work for that, because only with a multilateral tax policy we can achieve what Joël was arguing for. I very much like Manfred's positive approach because it's good in these days to be optimistic, first of all. And secondly, I see there a certain chance also to work with the German presidency. And if there is a chance to influence the German presidency with the idea of reshaping the narrative, you will find me on your side. Last remark, because I forgot our friend from Tanzania to give a response on his question, why do you hope for Africa as a decisive player? Well, there is, first of all, the demographic element. If you are half of the global population in a couple of decades, you are so decisive that you see all the problems, but you also find all the sources of improvement in your continent. On the other hand, well, not only resources in practical terms, the main resource of the continent of Africa is its young people. And these young people do not deserve to end up drowning in the Mediterranean. They have to have hope, and they have to have a project. And this project is possibly also to leading the world to a better future, especially when we successfully can implement the sustainability goals of the United Nations.
Udo, thank you very much. We are a little bit running out of time, but and I see a lot of interesting questions in the chat, which we can unfortunately not not take. For example, the question also on a CSO strategy, so to make sure that civil society, for example, is involved in this future EU-Africa partnership. I have other questions also again on public health, also peace and security. I would take a very last question, and Lisa Monsieur from the International Crisis Group, if I'm not mistaken. Lisa, is your question still relevant? Then you have the chance now to speak to our panelists, and then I would invite our panelists, to a last round of statements. Lisa, please introduce yourself, and the floor is yours.
Okay, am I unmuted? Yes.
You are unmuted.
Okay.
Keep it short and concise. Yes. Thanks.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk as well, even if we are short on time. Just two questions very quickly. One was basically on the equal partnership. I find that the fact that the European Union has put out their kind of vision for a strategy before even consulting with the African Union is kind of in the optics a little bit going in a different direction of saying we have an idea, a vision for Africa, and afterwards we will discuss with Africa how they see this, rather than the other way around. I'm wondering how this is perceived from the AU side, if Fatima has any views on that, because I found that quite surprising, the way the whole drafting of the strategy happened and the sequencing, basically, in terms of consultations with the African side. And the other point was more on the peace and security question. I don't know if we'll have time for this now, but a question on the fact that the EU has been for a long time an important partner on peace and security, also for the financing, of course, through the African Peace Facility. And how far is that still the case, or is are there other more important partners now for the EU side when it comes to support and cooperation on peace and security? Thanks very much for this and for the interesting discussion.
Lisa, thank you very much. And for this question, also again on peace and security, and maybe Fatem, I give you the floor for to answer the question if you want, and also for your remarks. And please come a bit closer to the microphone.
Yeah, I put a microphone, so I hope it's better.
It's very
for
good.
The
I understand you very well. Perfect.
Good. Perfect.
Please.
I'll take a few questions if you allow me, not all. Maybe on the point of the reshoring of some of the point that was made earlier on investments and creating, industries, I would say, on the continent. I mean, that remains quite critical, and I mean, the question that is being raised, including by some African countries, is what happened to the European Investment Plan, which came really as a, with the big bank, but there's still a lot of intransparency around how it's used, and how much really of an engagement do African countries themselves, or what space is there for them to engage with that. There are also questions on how well that would work. I believe there was 4.5 billion put to try and leverage investments of up to 44 billion. But I think data that is available out there, I believe the colleagues from ODI have done quite a fantastic study. They're looking at experiences from the World Bank, for instance, that simply show that the ambition of leveraging 44 billion is perhaps unrealistic. So I mean, knowing also that program will come again and under the next, at least it's proposed it would come back under the next financial, the multi-annual financial framework, I think requires some engagement, some space to be given to African partners to truly make that as a useful tool for everybody. Now, but still, I think there's some questions to really tap into that potential. And I would agree with your colleague there that there is potential provided by the COVID situation to create that type of industry in Africa. But let us not remember that all of that would require also infrastructure. We do have a major infrastructure gap, a financing gap included in Africa at the moment, which development aid will simply not be able to finance. So we need to think of other models to do that. On the point on IFF, I can't agree more, and in particular around trade around mispricing. I think Udo raised that point. There are questions on how how the international community is willing to deal with that, which we weren't fully able to address during the SDG negotiations. So. But it's worth engaging further on. Now, very briefly on the last question, the two last questions of the issue. Yeah, sorry, very briefly. Sorry, on the issue of strategies. I mean, with the African Union's chairperson, Commission's chairperson, has made it quite clear that. I think the EU has the right to develop its strategy. We also have our own internal strategy to that effect. And the ambition is to try and see how do we bring that together. So I think each partner can develop what it wants to develop as long as that's not imposed as a document. On the APF, it would be critical for the EU to continue to engage with the African peace and security architecture through the APF, and particularly that new instruments are being put into place. The EU is part of the governing board, so there should be no other questions in terms of how resources are managed. As are other international partners, I think there the role of the UN is very critical, and the discussion on, in terms of the use of the UN assessed contributions there is in fact far more critical from the point of view of the AU than financing coming from the EU. So that discussion at the UN level is actually what is truly critical at the moment. Thanks.
Okay, Faten, thank you very much. We have 3 minutes left, so I invite Christina and Udo just to pick the most pressing issue you would like to mention. First, Christina, 1 minute, very sorry, and then for his final remarks, I would like to give the floor to Udo.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I will be very brief. We have seen that EU-Africa or cooperation with Africa has gained importance in recent years for the EU, and I think Corona because of Corona, the partnership could remain very relevant could remain very high on the agenda, but with a maybe different substantial orientation. There's a lot of path dependency in the partnership, which is good, but I think when moving forward in the medium term, 2 adjustments are needed. One is to make the partnership more political, and the other one is to move beyond investments and really work towards a sustainability transformation and engagement on a sustainability transformation.
Christina, thank you very much. And Udo, please, floor is yours. You need the microphone, please. Yeah.
You get me now? Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Many thanks to everybody who contributed. Good luck for the whole series of your exercises on Africa and the relationship Global North, Global South. I love it. I will watch it. We cannot say, and that's my personal resume, we cannot say after Corona, we wake up in another world, but our relationships continent-wise will be the same. No, this is wrong. This is totally wrong. Let us review our strategy. Let us review our commitments. Let us get more engaged and not less, but let us know what we are doing. Again and again, let's ex ante and expose, measure whom we benefit, whom we serve, and let us empower those people who are working for change to the better in Africa as well as in Europe. We need a civic society for that, and I hope that everybody will follow us and support us, and we would like to contribute to this debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Udo, for those final words. I think it became clear that there's still a lot to discuss, so I can only once again recommend our webinar series. We'll definitely, because there's so many wonderful questions in the chat, we'll definitely go through the questions and see which questions we can include in our upcoming webinars. The next webinar will focus, or the next 3 webinars actually will focus on the finance instruments. We'll start next week with INDICI and its implications on democracy promotion in Sub-Saharan Africa. One remark on this, we had to reschedule it. It will not start at 2 p.m. It will start at 3:30. So if you registered for that webinar, make sure you change the time in your agenda. You'll receive an invitation tomorrow or the latest. Tomorrow the latest. Thank you everyone for the participation. Thanks again to the speakers. Thanks to our 2 interpreters. Thanks to all the participants. Thank you to our technical support, which has done a wonderful job in the back of this webinar. We are looking forward to seeing you again next week and discussing the topic in more depth on democracy promotion. Thank you very much.